Lotusbubble, or Lydia Elaine, is a freelance artist. Her art is colorful and mesmerizing to me. I have been fascinated by it for a long time, which is why I decided to study Lotusbubble's art. Through artist studies, I hope to develop and improve in my own art by trying out new things. And today I would like to share what I learned from studying Lotusbubble's art. For this, I'll go through different elements that make up the art. I like to focus on separate elements one at a time to simplify the studying process. Afterwards, I'll combine all the elements in my own illustration. Now let's start with the first element. Lotusbubble's artwork often features many painted overlines, which vary in thickness and contribute to a painterly, sketchy style. The clearest lines are typically found around the face, providing definition and focus. In contrast, the hair and clothes often have less and at times no line art, giving them a softer and more blended appearance. When lines are present, they are usually brown or colored, fitting to the color surrounding the lines. Some illustrations feature more outlines, while others have almost none, emphasizing the painterly style and allowing colors and shapes to blend more naturally. Characters in Lotusbubble's art range from 6 to 7 heads tall for females and 7 to 8 heads tall for males. The proportions are fairly straight, with some changes of direction that add natural movement to the figures. The characters aren't too muscular, meaning their body outlines don't feature too many changes of direction and are rather straight or rounded. Female characters typically have slightly longer legs compared to their upper bodies, while male characters have more equal proportions. The torso of male characters tends to be more square or boxy, whereas female characters have more of an hourglass shape with a thinner waist. Male characters often have wider necks, contributing to a more realistic and robust appearance. Limbs taper at the wrists and knees, creating a realistic yet slightly stylized Disney-like look. For female characters, the face shape is rounded. Male characters, on the other hand, have more defined square faces with slightly wider chins, giving them a stronger and more mature look. Faces are generally wide with balanced proportions, where the distance between the eyebrow line and the nose is equal to the distance from the nose to the chin or the eyebrow line to the hairline. However, expressions and perspectives can change this. In a three-quarter view, the transition from the outward direction of the chin to the upward direction of the face outline typically occurs between the eyes and ears, though this isn't always visible due to the rounded face shape. This transition can also appear at the mouth level and is sometimes higher for male characters. In side portraits, female faces are rounded while male faces are sharper. Lighting at times also defines the jawline when no lines are added. In the front view, nostrils are mostly visible, with the shading adding light and sometimes highlights. The nose can be outlined at the nose bridge at times, or shading defines this. Most commonly, lines would be added at the lower part of the nose, where the nostrils are. Here, typically, the planes of the nose are well defined, with the top of the nose often catching the light. This highlights the nose planes, giving it a three-dimensional appearance. Lips are usually depicted with a red or orangish hue and often feature highlights, creating a glossy or matte appearance. They are generally full and thick with varied shapes. Male characters have slightly longer, thinner lips compared to the fuller lips of female characters. Lines portraying the mouth typically appear in the middle and corners with varying thicknesses to add depth and realism. Teeth are represented with a wide shape for expression where the mouth is open. Eyebrows are generally thick and textured, with smaller hairs at the start. They are thicker at the inner part and become thinner towards the outer part, maintaining a rather straight appearance. This texturing adds to the realism and detail of the character's expressions. From the eyebrows, let's move on to the eyes next. For this, we focus on the shape of the eyes Lotusbubble draws first. Female characters have larger, taller eyes compared to the more narrow and less rounded eyes of male characters. Eyes are placed around the middle of the head and have an almond or round shape, with the inner corner lower and the outer corner higher. The upper eyelid line is thicker, especially at the outer corner. The eye outline is usually complete except for the lower part, which often has small empty spaces. Small lashes are added at times, most commonly for female characters. The iris is circular and large, with multiple shading layers that add depth and vibrancy. First, there is a base color layer, providing the base tone of the iris. A shadow is added below the upper eyelash, creating a sense of depth. For adding light, I use two layers here. The first layer of light at the lower part of the iris, as well as a second, more intense layer of light in the same area. For even more detailed shading, a hue variation layer might be included to add richness and complexity. Highlights are small and detailed, often located at the edge of the iris, adding a sparkling effect. The white of the eye includes shadows below the upper eyelid and at times more shading around the overall eye shape. Shading around the eyes includes the darkest shadow at the inner corner of the eyeline and below the eyebrow. I use the second shadow layer here to add cooler tones at different parts surrounding the eyes. Saturated areas around the mouth and cheeks add a blush effect, giving the skin a more vibrant appearance. This blush isn't always, but often added. Detailed face shading defines the volume and structure of the face. Subsurface scattering is also used at the edges of shadows, often making them more saturated, which creates a more realistic skin appearance. Lotusbubbles' hair in her art features few lines, focusing instead on shapes and messy strands. Hair is flowy with many added lines for individual strands, creating a sense of movement and liveliness. The process involves a rough sketch, painting in shapes, and then adding defining lines during rendering. This results in a transition where hair colors and lines often blend together. Hair strands vary in thickness, with many flyaway hairs adding to the messy, natural look the hair Lotusbubble draws tends to have. Hair shading involves multiple layers. A base layer provides the base color, followed by a general shadow layer to create depth. A second, darker shadow layer adds more dimension, and a third, darkest shadow layer enhances this further. An additional layer might be used for saturated parts or reflected light, adding complexity to the shading. Shadow shapes can be blocky or blended, with warm tones around the face adding to the natural look. Highlights are created with zigzaggy or blocky shapes that follow the shape of the head, giving the hair a shiny and dynamic appearance. Hair over the eyes partially conceals the eyes and eyelashes, or cover them fully at times. Clothing lines are thicker for silhouettes and thinner for folds, with folds mostly portrayed through shading. Clothes often lack many lines and are sometimes colored, blending with the overall painterly style. Fold lines are often incomplete, featuring triangular or rounded shapes. Outfits are generally simple, having either a casual, formal, medieval, angelic, or fantasy aesthetic to them, which depends on the character that is depicted in the illustration. As a basic outfit, Lotusbubble may draw a shirt and pants and add like 2 simple accessories, for example. Layers using jackets or scarves, for example, can be added, but often they are not. Suggestions of outfit parts and accessories are added with simpler painterly strokes usually. The face is the most rendered part, while for the clothes they would be less rendered, but in such a way that you're still able to tell what clothing pieces should be portrayed. Lotusbubble's palette includes vibrant, saturated colors, often warm with peachy, reddish, or orangish tones. There is hue variation within the shading and lighting, adding depth and interest to the colors. Outfits feature various colors, but can also include casual black and white or gray for armor, often with colorful accents. Lotusbubble uses diverse lighting scenarios, creating various shadows and often emphasizing the face. Overcast lighting, strong directional lighting, and high contrast are common shading features. Blended shapes with varying colors and intensity, warm light and cool shadows, or muted shadow colors with saturated light colors are typical. Shadows often have soft edges, especially for the skin, creating a smooth appearance. Subsurface scattering adds to the realism with more saturated shadow edges. Shading involves several layers. First the first base layer, a second base layer to add some color variation to the base color. Next we have the first shadow layer, then a second shadow layer. After this I added a light layer and finally a hue variation layer. Keep in mind that for demonstration purposes I add 1 layer for each new color I use. For Lotusbubble, here I noticed how much hue variation within the colors there can be, so I adapted this at times and picked a few new colors to not end up with a super high amount of layers while still reaching a similar shading result as in her illustrations. This multi-layer approach allows for rich, vibrant shading that enhances the overall depth and realism of the artwork. Backgrounds are often simple and white, but some illustrations feature detailed scenes. Extra effects include small white particles, rainbow lights, hearts, or lighting reflections, adding a dynamic element and more detail to the artwork. Now that we are done with the analysis part of this video, let's move on to the demonstration part, drawing an illustration where I try to include what I found out through the analysis by combining all the elements mentioned. For this, I drew my OC Yumari, the moon guardian of his world, who I've also drawn illustrations of for some of my previous art style analysis videos. I started with the head and moved on to the body. Even though I didn't draw in the full upper body in the final illustration, I did this here as I wanted to make sure the body's anatomy works, that the arm's position would make sense, for example. Next I sketched the hand, and after this the head. For the features, I started with the nose and then the mouth. Drawing this was pretty different from how I usually draw, as I added the full lips instead of just a line for the mouth. I was unsure whether I should draw an open mouth or a closed one. Yumari is a rather calm person, so going for a big smile would have been unrealistic, but I saw Lotusbubble draw in a slightly open mouth for many of her characters, so this is what I went with for the sketch here. After this I drew in the eyes. For this I went with a rectangular shape that's a bit rounded. After the eyebrows and a bit of adjusting, it was time for drawing in the hair. This worked nicely as I just drew in a lot of flowy strands. Including flow was the key here, and for me this tends to work nicely when I sketch rather quickly and intuitively, not focusing on making each stroke perfect. I filled in my sketch of the face with colored silhouettes. This helps me to see more clearly if the volume and placement of different parts work. I adjusted the mouth and closed it fully here. here. Next, I sketched in Yumari's outfit. I added some jewelry for this since I saw Lotusbubble adding small jewelry parts like this multiple times before. I also added a small bracelet, rings and an earring. I noticed the neck was too long and moved the head downwards. After filling in the silhouette of the body, I continued with adjusting the neck. Then I went back to the face, switching to the version with Yumari's open mouth again, and here I added in some planes of the face. I wanted to make sure the structure works, especially for shading later on. I also added a necklace he would be holding in his hand. You can see I made minor tweaks to his eyes and mouth to make it seem more like he's smiling by moving the lower part of the eye and mouth corners upwards. Then I moved on to line art. I went with rather thick lines going over the sketch since Lotusbubble tends to use thicker lines that are at times painted over. For the hair I especially made sure to include a lot of varying line thickness, making the outer lines thicker and the inner ones thinner. I drew the rest of the line art, making body outlines thicker than outfit lines. I used very thick lines for the jewelry accessoire parts I would later on color. For the hair I added even thicker line art around the face. I wanted to draw more attention to it this way. Next I filled in flat colors. At first these were just randomly picked without much of a system, but I used the palettes from my analysis to pick new colors I would use in the illustration. Before I applied these, I tried out some lighting scenarios to use, including warm and cool lighting. I adjusted the face again here. I was pretty unhappy with how the proportions looked for some reason, but I went a bit overboard here, looking back, spending too much time on trying to adjust the illustration, when at some point I had been looking at it for too long and couldn't see it as clearly. Just stepping away from trying to fix the illustration for a bit and adjusting it, maybe at the end would have made more sense. You can see how in the adjusted version I drew by painting over the eyes also turned out more turned upwards, giving Yumari a less gentle look. I was unsure what would suit Lotusbubble's art style more, if she would go for more upwards turned eyes similar to her other illustrations, or for a character like Yumari who in his design has rather downwards turned eyes, she would draw them in more turned downwards as well. Next I started shading. I used a pretty yellowish color for the skin and a reddish one for shading. The shading color here looks too reddish and dark to me, but as I was drawing in thought it may work when the rest of the colors are added. If not, I would adjust it later on. I added in various other colors for the shading, as determined by the shading system, and moved on to the eyes, again shading them using what I learned during the analysis part. I also painted the lips. It's kind of fun shading them in a detailed way. Maybe I'll include thicker lips in some of my future illustrations as well. I shaded the hair after this. Figuring out how I would do this was a bit challenging, but it was fine to me in the end. Since Yumari has white hair, it meant I could let the lights colors influence the hair colors a lot. That's why I added more purple, pink, blue and yellow parts here. I especially liked adding the neon blue hair highlights in the end. Next I moved on to the clothes, shading them using rough strokes and adding various colors again. Since I wasn't too happy with how the face looked, I adjusted the shading on it next. I tried changing up the shadow borders a bunch of times. I also adjusted my shadow layers in general, making the shadow colors a bit brighter and softer. Then I shaded the accessoires and drew over the jewelry parts. Finally, I again adjusted some shading on the skin. After this, I moved on to the background. Lotusbubble doesn't always include detailed ones, but rather simple ones, and that's what I wanted to go for here as well. To make Yumari with his bright color stand out more, I thought about going for a dark background here. To this, I then added some warm and cold textured parts. Then I adjusted the shading again. Something about the colors wasn't quite working to me yet. I thought that it may also just be me not being used to using colors like Lotusbubble, but I experimented more nevertheless. After this, I added a few small moons and sparkles around Yumari. I also tried out a light background and painting over some edges here. Then I adjusted the face again, and here I then painted over various parts. I also added flowy small hair strands. After a lot of painting over more parts and some adjustments to the colors and shading, I added small particles in front of Yumari. Next I opened Clip Studio Paint to look for something else to include in the background. I found one particle brush which I used and exported as PNG. I imported this into Krita and added this with a white background instead of the dark one with textures. I wanted to make the skin more vibrant, so I experimented with the skin shading once again. However, I think it actually looked better before this, so I undid some of these changes for the final illustration, which was done after also adding a blur effect around Yumari. With the illustration finished, let's now reflect on the differences I see when comparing this to Lotusbubble's illustration. If you see any other differences, let me know in the comments. It would mean a lot since every person who looks at an illustration may notice different things. The first difference to me would be that my lines look not as sketchy at times. I use a process with clean line art and wanted to achieve a more messy look by painting over, whereas Lotusbubble also just paints over her sketch. Even though I tried to recreate the look of this through painting over, it still does come across differently from Lotusbubble's illustrations to me. I also think some of the edges of the face shading especially are too blurry, blended or smooth, which is probably caused by all the painting over and fixing I did as I painted this illustration. This would also lead me to the next point. My learnings from this art style study, first of this would be waiting with trying to fix things until the end and not do it at multiple stages throughout the shading process. I do fix my illustrations after the sketch and line art phase once, as well as after the full illustration is finished for my regular illustrations as well, and this makes sense to me, but here I would fix parts and paint over and over, leading to a lot of time spent on this. At some point I find you also have to step back to get a fresh perspective on the illustration, which makes it easier to fix things. Another learning from this study for me would be the importance of storytelling. Many of Lotusbubbles illustrations have a story or characters interacting, which is something I don't draw as often. On the other hand, I also learned that simplicity and simplifying can, for one, save time, but also help to bring focus to parts of the illustration. This can be done by drawing in and rendering the face in the most detailed way, while the clothes and accessories stay less refined. Next would be hue variation, especially for skin, including more various colors like here, and very saturated ones is something I'm not very familiar with, and I learned about this along the way here. I have a lot of room for improvement there though, and with that said, let's move on to the next aspect, which would be a few things I would like to focus on improving on or take as inspiration from Lotusbubble in my future art. First, as mentioned, this would be to try out including more various hues for the skin rendering and interesting lighting colors in general. Additionally, I really like the dynamicness and flowiness that Lotusbubble's illustrations can have, which is often created through the messy line art and way of coloring and rendering. I would like to learn to implement this in my own way into my illustrations as well. And that's it for this art style study. If you haven't checked out Lotusbubble's art, I'll leave links to it in the video description. If you're interested in seeing the full screen recorded process of drawing the basic body for this video, you can find it on my Patreon. I hope the video was inspiring and insightful to see for you. Thanks for watching. Bye!